There are nights that a person remembers not because anything was supposed to happen, but because everything ordinary about them turns out, later, to have been the last of its kind. For Melanie, it was a warm evening in the spring of 2023, and the ordinary thing was a motorcycle ride home from dinner with her husband, something the two of them had not done together in decades. They were not young anymore. The bikes had mostly sat. But the night was soft and the road was open, and so they rode, the way they had ridden when they were first in love, with the engine warm beneath them and the dark fields sliding past. For Melanie, the motorcycle had always meant one thing, and that thing was freedom. Music in her helmet, the wind against her chest, the road unspooling ahead with nothing between her and it. She would tell people afterward that those few miles were among the happiest of her recent life, that she had felt, in the dark with her husband ahead of her, entirely and uncomplicatedly alive. She had no way of knowing that the same machine that meant freedom to her had, 2 years before, taken her son. Because that is the part of this story you have to carry from the very beginning. 2 years before that warm spring night, Melanie's son, a young man named Corey, had died. He had died in a motorcycle accident, and his mother, who had buried him, who had learned to live in the particular silence that the death of a child leaves in a house, had climbed onto a motorcycle that night and ridden out into the dark because grief does not erase the things that once made us happy. It only complicates them. She saw the truck before anything was wrong with it. It was parked on the shoulder up ahead, headlights on, going nowhere. The kind of thing you register and dismiss in the same half-second. She rode toward it the way you ride toward anything stationary, expecting it to stay where it was, and then it didn't. The truck pulled out into the road in front of her and began, slowly and impossibly, to turn, a wide U-turn directly across her path, its long body swinging out to block the whole of the lane. There is a sentence Melanie remembers thinking in that instant, and it is striking precisely because it is so calm. Not a scream, not a prayer, just a clear, quiet observation, the kind of thought you might have about a chess move. This doesn't seem right. That is where most accounts of an accident would go to the impact, the sound of it, the violence. We are not going to do that, because that is not what Melanie remembers, and it is not what this story is about. What she remembers is that, in the space between this doesn't seem right and the thing that should have come next, the night changed. The road was still there, the truck was still there, but something else had entered the edges of her vision. A color where no color should be, warm and living and impossibly bright. It was red, and it was waiting for her. This is the account of Melanie D., an American woman who, in the seconds before a collision that should have killed her, was met first by her mother and then by the son she had already buried, and who came back from the operating table with a single stubborn message about what actually holds us together. This is NDE Cosmic Legacy. To understand why what happened next mattered so much, you have to understand who Melanie was before it happened, because she was not, by her own description, the kind of person who went looking for the supernatural. She was, in fact, almost the opposite. By profession, she was what is called an educational diagnostician, a person trained to look at a struggling child, gather the data, run the assessments, and tell you, as precisely as the evidence allows, what is actually going on. Her entire working life had been built on measurement, on not believing a thing until the number said so. She had been raised Catholic, and she carried the faith the way many people carry the faith they were raised in. Present but quiet, more a set of furniture in the back of the mind than a fire in the chest. She was not waiting for a sign. She was a practical woman in late middle age with a husband she loved and a profession she was good at and a grief she had folded into the shape of the rest of her life. She would have told you before that spring night that when people died, they were gone, and that the comfort we take from imagining otherwise is a comfort and nothing more. Her father had said as much all her life. He was a blunt man, and he had a phrase he used about death, the kind of phrase that sounds like wisdom when you are young and like a cold wind when you are older. When you die, he would say, you end up in the dirt. That was the family Melanie came from. Plain people who did not expect a reward and did not pretend to one. And so when she rode out into the dark that night, she carried with her Not only the freedom of the road and the grief of her son, but a whole world view. Careful, evidence-bound, unsentimental, that was about to be taken apart in a matter of seconds. The truck's headlights had not seemed important. That is worth sitting with, because it is the kind of detail that haunts the people it happens to. A vehicle parked on the shoulder at night, lights on, is the most unremarkable thing in the world. You see 100 of them. You think nothing. And then one of them, exactly once in your life, becomes the hinge on which everything turns. The truck pulled out. It began its turn. Its body swung across the road like a wall being built in the time it takes to breathe. We know from the few facts that can be established what the night did to her body. She lost close to 40% of her blood. She was hurt badly enough that an ordinary ambulance was not enough. She was flown, life-flighted, lifted off that road by a helicopter and carried through the dark sky to a hospital where surgeons were waiting. She would need to be opened up and put back together. By any sober medical reckoning, a woman who loses that much blood on a roadside at night is a woman whose chances are not good. Her husband, riding with her, saw it happen. He would confirm later the thing that she would struggle to explain, that she had gone down, that the fall was real, that the events of that night were not the invention of an injured brain after the fact. My husband said that did happen, she would say, when she got to the parts that were hardest to believe. It is a small sentence, but it does a great deal of work. It places a witness at the edge of the impossible. But all of that, the blood, the helicopter, the surgeons, the husband kneeling on the asphalt, was happening to her body. And Melanie, in the account she would give once she could speak again, was no longer entirely inside it. She had seen the red, and the red she understood with a certainty she could not have explained had come for her. The red was not a thing. That is the first difficulty in describing what Melanie saw, and she was honest about the difficulty. It was not a red object, or a red light, or a red figure standing in the road. It was a presence, alive, she insisted on the word, alive. And its substance was a deep living red, warm and vivid, more like energy than like anything with edges. It hung in the dark at the periphery of the worst moment of her life, and it was not frightening. It was the opposite of frightening. It felt, she said, like being recognized. And then there were words. Across the surface of the red, written in the air itself, glowing in a bright living green, was a message. Melanie read it the way you read something you already somehow knew. The letters hanging there in the dark as plainly as a sign above a door. "You're going to come with me for a little while," the green word said, "but you're not going to stay." She did not, in that first instant, know whose presence it was. She knew only that it was familiar in the way that warmth is familiar, in the way a voice from another room is familiar before you have consciously placed it. And then the presence asked her something, not aloud, because there was no aloud, but directly into her mind, the way the green words had been written directly onto the air. "Do you understand?" And Melanie, who had spent her whole careful life understanding things only after she had checked them, found that she understood this immediately and completely. She did. She was going to go for a little while. She was not going to stay. It was her mother. The recognition came not as a face. There was no face, only the living red. But as a certainty that arrived whole, the way you know your mother's hand in the dark. Her mother who had died, who was supposed to be gone, who was supposed by her father's plain reckoning to be in the dirt and nowhere else, was here, on a road at night made of warm red light, telling her daughter in green letters that the journey ahead was real but temporary. There is a thing worth pausing on here, because it is the thing that makes accounts like Melanie's so difficult to dismiss out of hand and so difficult to prove. The message she received was not the message a frightened, dying brain would be expected to invent. A dying brain, flooded and starved, might reasonably conjure peace, or terror, or a tunnel, or nothing at all. What it produced for Melanie, in her telling, was something stranger and more specific. A structured reassurance, delivered in color and in text, with a clear and limited promise. "You will come. You will not stay. Do you understand?" It reads less like a hallucination than like an instruction, given gently by someone who loved her, at the threshold of the worst thing that had ever happened to her body. She would say much later that the green writing was among the details she was least able to explain and least willing to let go of. She had no framework for it. She was a woman of measurements, and there was no measurement for words written in the air over the living red presence of her dead mother. But she had read them. She was sure she had read them. And she would carry their grammar, the come, the little while, the not going to stay, like a sentence she had been handed to hold. Because the red presence had not come alone. Having delivered her message, having made certain her daughter understood, Melanie's mother did something that mothers do. She stepped aside, gently, the way you step aside in a doorway to let someone past, and she let Melanie see who was waiting behind her. Where the mother had been red, this new presence was blue. A calm blue, Melanie said, cooler than the warm living red, steadier, quieter. It came forward out of the place behind her mother, and Melanie knew it before she could possibly have known it. Knew it the way she had known the red was familiar, except that this knowing was not gentle. This knowing went through her like a current. She recognized him, not by a face, because there was no face. She recognized him by love. It was Corey. It was her son. He had been dead for 2 years. He had died, as she had nearly just died, on a motorcycle, in the dark, and she had buried him and survived the burying the way parents are forced to survive the unsurvivable, by simply continuing to be alive in the mornings. And now, in the seconds before her own collision, here he was. Not a memory, not a wish, but a calm blue presence coming toward her out of the company of the dead, and she knew him instantly and entirely. And the recognition was the purest thing she had ever felt. And then he did something that broke her open, and that she would never be able to tell without her voice changing. He made a face, a specific face, a goofy, deliberate, exaggerated expression, the one he had always pulled to make her laugh, the private clownish look that had been his alone, that he had used on her across kitchen tables and car seats and 1,000 ordinary afternoons of his too short life. He pulled that face at her, there at the edge of death, made of blue light, and the sentence she would use to describe it ever after holds the whole of her grief and the whole of her joy folded together. Even in heaven, he was still my son. It was the proof, for her, that nothing essential had been lost, not the soul as an abstraction, not a vague continuation. Corey, the actual boy, with his actual sense of humor, with the exact face he made, intact and recognizable and still teasing his mother. Whatever else death was, it had not taken the thing that made him him. And then the blue presence changed its shape. It drew itself together and became a form Melanie struggled to describe except by its function. It became a wedge of blue light, narrow and pointed, and it placed itself, there is no other way to say it, between her and the accident, between her and the truck, between her, she understood, and the pain. He had gotten between me and the pain of the accident, she would say, and the simplicity of it is the whole of it. Her dead son, given the chance to do one thing for his living mother as she crossed toward where he already was, chose to do the thing he could do. He put himself in the way of her suffering. This is the heart of the account, and it is worth letting it be exactly as strange and as tender as it is. There is no theology being argued here, no doctrine. There is only a mother's report that, in the moment her body was being broken on a roadside, the son she had lost arranged himself like a shield, so that the impact she should have felt was, in some manner she could not explain and would not stop insisting upon, taken by him instead. She did not feel the crash. She felt, where the crash should have been, her son. People who have lost children sometimes describe a particular hunger, not to be told that their child is in a better place, which can sound like a door being closed, but to know that the child is still, in some real sense, themselves. Still funny, still theirs, still capable of turning around at the threshold and making the old face. That is what Melanie was given, in blue, on a dark road, in the worst and most luminous seconds of her life. And from behind the wedge of him, the world tilted, and she found herself rising, up off the road, up away from the truck, up to where she could look down on all of it. What she saw looking down, was the scene of her own catastrophe. She saw the road, she saw the truck, she saw the motorcycle down on the asphalt, and her husband near it, and this is the detail that gives the account its terrible specificity. She saw her own body. She watched it from above as it rose, as it moved with a broken wrist, as it cried out in pain. She could see that the body was in agony, and she felt none of it. She observed her own suffering the way you might observe a stranger's, with concern but without sensation, lifted clear of the nerve and the bone, watching the worst night of her life happen to a woman on a road who happened to be her. There is a clinical name for what she was describing, of course, an out-of-body experience, the perception of viewing oneself from outside, reported in a substantial fraction of near-death accounts and studied, carefully and without sensationalism, by researchers who take the phenomenon seriously. We will come to what medicine can and cannot say about it. For now, it is enough to follow Melanie, who was not thinking about the literature, who was simply rising, watching her husband kneel on the asphalt beside the wreck of their ordinary happy evening. She did not stay above the road. The scene changed, not jarringly, but the way scenes change in the most vivid kind of dream, one place dissolving into the next without a seam, and the next place was a room she had never seen because she had never been conscious in it. It was the operating room. She was above it now, looking down, and below her were the masked figures of surgeons and nurses bent over a body that she understood, with the same calm she had felt the whole time, to be hers. They were working to save her. She could see the urgency in their hands, and behind them, Melanie said, there were others, not solid, not the doctors. Standing behind the surgical team, she saw beings of white light, presences she could only call angels, because she had no other word, though they did not look like the angels of any painting. They were not figures so much as a clear, bright, attentive presence, and they were positioned behind the doctors, and they appeared, this is her account, given as plainly as she could give it, to be guiding the doctor's hands. It felt like they were guiding the doctor's hands, she said. It felt like heaven and earth were working together. It is a remarkable image, and it is worth noticing what it does not do. It does not take the credit away from the surgeons. In Melanie's telling, the human beings in that room were doing exactly what their years of training had prepared them to do, with skill and with urgency, fighting for the life on the table. The white light presences were not replacing that work. They were, she felt, standing behind it, supporting it, steadying it, the way a hand might rest on the shoulder of someone doing something difficult and necessary. Heaven and earth, in her phrase, working together. Not one instead of the other. Both at once, over the same body. One of the surgeons, she would learn afterward, came away from operations with a conviction of his own, a sense that he sometimes felt God working through his hands. When Melanie told him what she had seen above that table, the bright presences steadying the work, he did not dismiss her. He agreed. It is the kind of small corroboration that proves nothing and unsettles everything. A woman on a table, lifted out of her body, sees light behind the surgeon's shoulders, and the surgeon, who saw no light at all, knows exactly the feeling she is describing. She watched them save her, and while they worked, while heaven and earth bent together over the broken body of an educational diagnostician who had never believed in any of this, Melanie was drawn further up and further in, away from the bright cold room, toward a place that had no walls, and, she would insist, no time. The place she came to was peace, and she struggled to say more than that, because the thing about a place with no time is that there is almost nothing in it to describe. There was no clock and no sequence, no sense of waiting or of hurrying, only a vast and settled calm that she experienced not as boredom, but as completeness, as though every restless thing in her had finally been allowed to stop. She would say that it was the most peaceful she had ever been or ever expected to be. Whatever else it was not the dirt her father had promised. And in that place, briefly, she was shown her own life. Not all of it, and not as punishment. She was insistent on that. It came the way a slideshow comes, images moving past her, and what she felt as she watched was not judgment from outside, but understanding from within. She saw the moments of her life in which she had been unkind, and she felt directly what that unkindness had been. She understood that to hurt another person was, in some real and inescapable sense, to hurt herself, because in the place she had come to, everyone was connected, and the line between one soul and another was not the solid wall she had spent her life assuming it was. And she saw the moments in which she had been kind, and she felt what those had been too. To be kind, she understood, was to heal. Not only the other person, but herself, not as a reward bolted on afterward, but as the same act seen from both sides. Cruelty and kindness were not behaviors with consequences. They were, in the logic of that place, the same thing as their consequences. In heaven, she would later put it, everyone is connected through love. Hurting another would feel like hurting yourself. It was the most ordinary moral instruction in the world, be kind, delivered not as a rule but as a fact about the structure of reality, felt in the body she no longer had. This is the part of near-death accounts that the careful and the skeptical often find most suspicious and most interesting at once, because it is so consistent across cultures and centuries and so resistant to the obvious explanations. People who have never met return with the same report, that they were shown their lives, that they felt the effects of their actions from the inside, and that they came back convinced that kindness is not a nicety, but the load-bearing fact of existence. Melanie, the woman of measurements, came back with exactly that conviction, and she had no measurement for it, and she could not make it go away. It was Corey who brought her back. He had stayed near her. The blue presence, then, as she described it, a more physical form, her son as she remembered him. And it was he who told her gently that there were things she could still do on the earth that could not be done from where he was. And then he showed her. Not abstractions, not duties. He showed her the small things, the absurdly, achingly small things that a life is actually made of. A hamburger, the wind on her face, the arms of someone she loved closing around her, laughter, the chance to help another person. He laid them out in front of her like a case for staying, and the case was not made of grand purposes. It was made of a meal and the wind and a hug and a laugh. He told her the time on earth was short and that he would be there when she returned to it. "I'll be there in a minute," he said, with the easy certainty of someone for whom the whole length of a human life is, in fact, about a minute. And the white light presences asked something of her too before she went. They asked her to go back and to remind people of a thing they had forgotten, that love is in all of us, and that we belong to one another. And then the peace folded shut, and the pain came back, and Melanie woke up in a hospital, unable to move, with a long road in front of her. She spent 10 days in the intensive care unit, though she would tell you the number meant nothing from the inside, because the timelessness she had touched did not entirely let go of her at once. She came back to a body that had been rebuilt and could not yet be used, held in a body cast, her neck in a cervical collar, unable to move her arms or her legs, a woman who had ridden out into the freedom of an open road and woken into the most complete physical confinement a person can endure. The recovery would be long and hard. The wind on her face, the thing Corey had used to argue her back into her life, was a long way off. But the other world had not finished with her, or perhaps she had not finished with it. In those first timeless days in the ICU, Melanie said, she continued to see what she was not supposed to be able to see. Her father came to her, the plain, blunt man who had told her all her life that the dead end up in the dirt. And he came specifically, she felt, to correct himself. He told her that he was not in the dirt. After a lifetime of that cold phrase, he had crossed it out. Her grandparents came too. The dead, it seemed, were keeping her company while the living worked to keep her alive. And she saw something about the living that she had never seen before. People came to her bedside and prayed. Family, friends, the ordinary faithful doing the ordinary thing that people do beside a hospital bed. And Melanie, lying in her cast, watched the prayers. She saw them as energy, rising up from the hands and the bowed heads of the people around her, lifting into the air of the room. And she saw that the energy went somewhere, and that it brought something back. Prayers go up, she said, and bring the angels down. The same white light presences she had seen behind the surgeons, she now saw drawn into the room by the prayers of people who had no idea they were doing anything but hoping. She began to talk about all of it as soon as she physically could. The moment the breathing tube came out, the words started, and they did not really stop. And here is where the story does something that the careful part of any listener has to sit up and notice. Because it stops being only Melanie's account and becomes, for one strange moment, something with an outside witness who could not have known. Sometime after the accident, Melanie's sister went to see a medium, a person who claimed to receive messages from the dead. Melanie was not there. The medium did not know her, did not know the family, did not know the particulars of a motorcycle accident on a dark road. And during that session, the medium told Melanie's sister something specific and unprompted, that there was a young man, and that the young man wanted them to know he had put himself between his mother and the thing she had hit. Between his mother and the thing she hit. It is, word for near word, the thing Melanie had been saying from her hospital bed. The wedge of blue light, the sun who got between her and the pain, described by a stranger in another room who had no way of knowing she had said it. We are careful on this channel about claims like that one. We do not tell you what it proves, because we do not know, and neither did Melanie, and neither, in the end, did the medium. We only tell you that it happened, that a detail Melanie reported from inside the impossible was repeated back to her family by someone standing entirely outside it. The woman who had spent her whole life refusing to believe a thing until the data confirmed it had, in the strangest possible way, been confirmed. She did not return to the careful, measured Catholicism of before. She became something her younger self would not have recognized. A person who believes she can see and hear the other side, who walked into a spiritualist church and stayed. The diagnostician had been re-diagnosed by her own life. Melanie came back from the operating table with a message, and it was not a complicated one. She had been asked by the beings of light to remind people of something they already knew and had mostly forgotten. And the something was this, that in the place she had been, everyone was connected through love, and that the way back to that connection, here, on the earth, in the short minute of a human life, is kindness. Kindness reconnects us, she said. Compassion reconnects us. Helping others reconnects us. She had seen, in her brief slideshow, that to wound another was to wound herself, and that to be gentle was to heal. She came back to tell us that this is not a sentiment. In the place she had been, it was simply how things are. She had also learned, she said, what is actually worth anything. And it was not what she might once have measured. Love is the most important thing in life, she put it. Not things, not titles, not status. The case her dead son had made for her return was not built out of accomplishments. It was built out of a hamburger, and the wind, and an embrace, and a laugh. He had known, from where he was, exactly what a life is made of, and it is made of the small, warm things we are too busy, or too frightened, or too grieved to notice we are holding. This is NDE Cosmic Legacy. Every week we bring you one account like Melanie's. One carefully researched story of a person who stood at the edge of death and came back carrying something they could not put down. We do not tell you what to make of these stories. We tell them as faithfully as we can, in the words of the people who lived them, and we leave the meaning where it belongs, with you. If something in Melanie's story reached you tonight, if you have ever lost someone and wished with everything in you that the love between you did not have to end, then do one small thing before you go. Leave a like. Not for us, and not for any algorithm. Leave it for the next person who needs this story. Someone scrolling tonight in the particular silence that grief leaves in a house, wondering whether the person they lost is still, in some real way, themselves. Your like is how this story finds them. It is a small lantern. It tells the dark where to send the light. Subscribe and turn on the bell if you would like to be here when the next account arrives. Every week there is another person, another threshold, another return. The bell is simply how you make sure you are in the room, and then leave us one thing in the comments below. Not a paragraph. One name. The name of someone you have lost and still love. Someone you would give a great deal to know is still themselves. Still pulling the old face across a kitchen table somewhere past the edge of the world. Just the name. Melanie believes they are not in the dirt. Tonight, name yours, and let this be the room where you say it. Last of all, Share this. Send it to one person you know who is carrying a loss right now. You do not have to write anything. Just pass it along. That is how the lantern moves from hand to hand, not because anyone makes us, but because someone decided not to keep the light to themselves. A truck turned across a dark road, and a mother should have died. Instead, she was met by warm red light, by green words written on the air, and by a calm blue boy who made the old goofy face and then stepped between his mother and the pain. She came back to tell us that we are connected, that kindness is the way home, and that the love does not stop at the edge of the field. Even in heaven, he was still her son. We will see you next week. Disclaimer. This is a personal account drawn from Endorf case, Berger 13517, publicly archived. It describes a near-death experience reported by Melanie D. following a serious motorcycle accident in 2023. The account references the death of the experiencer's adult son in an earlier motorcycle accident and is handled with that loss in mind. Secondary names have been generalized where appropriate to protect privacy. The beliefs expressed, including the experiencer's later identification as a spiritualist and medium, are her own, presented as she reported them, with no editorial claim as to their nature or truth, and no endorsement of any particular spiritual practice. If you are grieving, please be gentle with yourself. Support is available, and you do not have to carry it alone.